At this point, I want to talk about the importance of reading the book of Ruth in its ancient context. There are 3 words that are usually used to describe the structure of ancient Israelite society. Each one is built on the Latin word for father, pater. The first and most familiar word is patriarchal. In a patriarchal society, the father was the head of the household, and by extension, men held primary power and key positions in political, religious, and social leadership, and they controlled property. The second word used to describe ancient Near Eastern culture is patrilineal. Patrilineal comes from the Latin pater, father, and linea, the Latin word for thread. It refers to the organization of family relationships in societies by lines of descent from a person's male ancestors. Or to put it more simply, it traces lines of descent through the male line, which is exactly what we see in the genealogies in Genesis and in the closing genealogy in the book of Ruth. The third word commonly used to describe ancient Near Eastern society is patrilocal. Patrilocal also comes from the Latin word pater, father, and our English word local, and together they point to the ancient practice of locating or centering the residence within the husband's family or tribe. In other words, patrilocal means that a woman leaves her family to join her husband's family, which is exactly what Ruth and Orpah did when they married Naomi's sons in Moab. It's also what Ruth continued to commit herself to when she decided not to go back to her mother's house, but instead continued to be part of her husband's family by committing herself to Naomi. Because the book of Ruth features women and the words and traditions of women, it's interesting to ask whether the story also reflects the traditional assumptions about structuring the family and society around the father. The simple answer is yes. We see patriarchy, especially in chapter 4 of Ruth, where the men decide who buys or acquires Ruth as wife. Ruth has no say in the matter and is not even present during the negotiations. Then at the end of chapter 4, we have a classic genealogy that features 10 men. But we see other relational dynamics in the book that suggest there were other hierarchical structures at work in ancient Israel. The book of Ruth also contains examples of challenges to traditional patriarchal ordering and power. Boaz, for example, challenged the classical patriarchal assumption that women should serve men when he served Ruth a meal. The renowned biblical scholar and archaeologist Carol Myers thinks that there is a better way to describe the complexities of relationships between men and women that we see in the Old Testament, a better way than patriarchy and other pater-related terms. She suggests that we use the term hierarchy, another word with Latin roots. Hierarchy comes from 2 Latin words, heter, which means other or many, and archy, which means rule or government. And together, the expression hierarchy means many rule. That is to say, it is not always the father or men in general. Instead, there are a number of competing and intersecting hierarchies functioning in Israelite society. The idea here is that Israelite society was not simply organized by structures that placed men over women, but instead it was based on a number of intersecting hierarchies among individuals and groups. These hierarchies were influenced by gender, age, class, and ethnicity. Let me give you an example of what is meant by an intersecting hierarchy that involved women of different ages and ethnicities. In chapter 1, Naomi tried to exercise her motherly authority over her Moabite daughters-in-law when she orders Ruth and Orpah to return to Moab. But only Orpah complies with her demand. Ruth boldly refuses to obey her mother-in-law. Later in the story, after Naomi sets out her risky plan that Ruth approach Boaz at night and propose, Ruth defers to her older mother-in-law and says, "I will do whatever you say." Clearly, a number of factors influenced the relationship between the older Israelite widow Naomi and the younger Moabite daughter-in-law. We also witness a number of other hierarchies at work among the various people in Boaz's field in chapter 2. As an unattached Moabite widow, Ruth was at risk of sexual harassment and abuse by Boaz's male servants who were well positioned to take advantage of the power they assumed they had over a widowed Moabite gleaner. Boaz recognized the power differential, however, and made sure that Ruth was protected. Another series of challenges to traditional patriarchal assumptions is found in chapter 4, where the women challenge the patriarchal assumption that sons have more value than daughters when they insisted that Naomi's Moabite daughter-in-law was better than 7 sons. Sons, of course, were highly valued in the ancient culture. The more sons one had, the better. 7 or 8 sons were viewed as ideal. Israelite society was also based on a tribal or clan structure that included a social safety net for widows, orphans, the poor, and foreigners. A number of Old Testament laws address specific situations of need, including the need for food. Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10, for example, commands landowners to leave produce in the fields and on the vines for gleaners in need of food to harvest. It reads like this: "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over the vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God." Gleaning is what Ruth, a Moabite widow, will do to get food for Naomi and herself. Similarly, a variety of laws of redemption were put in place to help out individuals in need. One such law allowed for the redemption of land after a family member like Naomi's husband Elimelech moved off the land or died. And we read about that in Leviticus 25 to 34. Other laws allowed for redemption of relatives sold into slavery because of debt, and the redemption of objects that had been given over to the sanctuary. We read about that in Numbers 35. There may also have been a practice of marrying a kinsman-redeemer, which is what Ruth did when she married Boaz, but it's not specifically laid out in the Old Testament. But it certainly fits with other ancient practices of redemption. Ruth and Boaz's marriage is also frequently described as a Levirate marriage. Levirate marriage involved the brother of a deceased man marrying the deceased widow in order to produce a son who would preserve the name of the dead and inherit the dead man's property. The thought of marrying a brother-in-law or a close relative may strike you as very strange and perhaps even abhorrent. But we need to remember that we're talking about ancient Israel here, and the purpose of the laws of redemption and the Levirate laws was to protect the widow, the orphan, and the outsider from isolation and death. We always need to remember that the ancient world is very different from our world. It was impossible for any person to survive on their own in the ancient world. And so widows needed to be drawn into a family and a community through marriage just in order to survive.